Hi everybody, welcome to InfoSec People's Neurodiversity Thought Piece. I am Becca, I'm Delivery Recruitment Partner here at InfoSec People, and I'm joined by a wonderful panel of people who've come to speak to me today. So I've got Alice, I've got Chris and Steph and Lee joining me today. Hi everybody and welcome, and thank you for bearing with me while I put the recording on. So I'm really keen to keep things as casual as possible today, in the sense of I'd like everybody to feel relaxed and comfortable, but I'd also be really keen to get your thoughts on, ADHD more specifically, just from personal experience, but neurodiversity as a whole as well, and what that means to the cybersecurity community. So the first question I have is, when was the first time you heard the term neurodiversity? And I would love to go to Lee to start with.
Yep. Hi, Becca. Hi, everyone. So the first time that I heard the term neurodiversity, but also the term neurotypical, was when I was diagnosed with ADHD last year. So before that, those two terms were not really something I had read or I had seen anywhere, especially when it came to that conversation around diversity, right? So along with the new diagnosis of being or having combined ADHD, it was a very new language as well to start to understand and explore.
That's absolutely fascinating. Yeah. I wonder if we can go to Alice next. Alice, what about
Sure.
you?
Hi, everybody. So I would say the first time I've heard the term neurodiversity I'd say in the past 3 years, and I can't exactly pinpoint when it was. I started just seeing a lot more written about it, neurodiversity, neurotypical, which is interesting. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was really young, like 6 or 7. Again, can't really pinpoint it because I wouldn't have been able to pick up time at that point. But I didn't necessarily consider that diverse or neurodiverse. I guess because if you grow up with a certain thing or you just have that as part of your life, you don't necessarily, it's just normal for you. And it wasn't until and even in the beginning of neurodiversity, I always just was like, oh, it's autism or, and then I started realizing actually well, those things converge a lot. But I also realized, oh, actually that's me. Like I'm neurodiverse. And the first time I think I realized that was in the past 18 months. But the first time I heard the word was, I think, probably about 2, 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, I think. I never really heard the term neurodiversity until I actually came into a sort of professional environment. And even then, I mean, I've been working since I was about 16, 17, and I'm 30 now. So, even then, I don't think I've really heard that term, apart from, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, in one of my sort of sales jobs that I had. And that was purely because a candidate told me they were neurodiverse. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, okay, that's really cool. What does that mean? For me, it was such a unheard of word. Not in the sense that I didn't want to find out more about it, but just that I didn't really understand what it meant, so I couldn't use it, I suppose, if that makes sense. Chris, I mean, from a hiring perspective, what about you? When was the first time you heard that word used, would you say?
So I would say that relatively recently, I mean, again, we're probably talking within the past 2 years, probably that I first became aware of the term. However, given my kind of what I do for a living and my hobbies as well, I found myself around lots of neurodivergent folks, and I was familiar with the diagnoses that make up neurodivergency, but wasn't necessarily aware of that term that kind of captured all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a shame that it's not been around for as long, because I feel like we could have progressed a lot more in a lot of ways. What about you, Steph? What about your thoughts? I mean, I know that you've been working in cybersecurity for quite some time, so yeah, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts as well.
I think the first time I heard of it was when I was listening to loads of podcasts for the Australian Broadcasting Network, because I was going to go to Tasmania. So I was just listening to them, and I ended up getting into their specific one, All in the Mind. I was just about to do the accent of the lady who ran that podcast. I shan't. But I used to listen to loads of, they did some really interesting stuff on autism. And Steve Silberman, they'd interviewed him about his book called Neurotribes, and he was talking about a high rate of kids being diagnosed with autism in Silicon Valley and other tech spaces against the national sort of ratio. And I was like, and of course, cybersecurity, always looking for new pathways, all of that sort of stuff. So my thing was, well, let's have a listen to that. Then I bought the book. The book is hilarious because it talks about lots of different scientists who wouldn't have had a diagnosis, but had the money and the capability to build the world the way they wanted it. And I mean, insane, you know, you had the Wizard of Clapham Common, all, you know, just amazing people who allowed you know, students from places like Cambridge and Oxford to borrow their systems in order to do their research within those institutions, and had come up with, you know, lots of different scenarios ahead of those scientists who were then eventually 100, 150 years later given the prize, because socially these guys wouldn't have known or cared what the value of what they were learning or their special interest was to the rest of the planet. You know, they were, you know, that naivety and stuff like that. So yeah, it became that probably seven years ago, maybe 8 now. So when we ran, when Cybersecurity Challenge ran the first Autism into Cyber Day, we wanted to call that neurodiversity. We wanted to call that event. And we eventually, off the back of that first event that we ran in the UK, or the first of its kind in the UK, a lot of the industry were in situ at that event. We had a business stream, we had lots of kids running around doing all these activities. We had 2 13-year-old kids that did a 30-minute pen test in under 140 seconds. I mean, you know, headphones on, sunglasses on, beanie, but you know, just brilliant. And it really woke the industry up to why we need to build better pipeline, because the criminals are super organized and super active, and they're looking after they're you know, they're grooming these kids online. So yeah, it was a real big sea change, I think, for the industry, that event. But yeah, that was my first intro to the term.
Well, that's amazing. A 30-minute pen test in 140 seconds, did you say?
Literally, and I won't even say which company built it.
Oh no, I feel like maybe that's not we shouldn't divulge that, but that's amazing, isn't it? I mean, like, it just kind of, it goes to show, doesn't it? Like, you know, I mean, I really struggled with the sort of neurodivergent label to start off with, and I think that's because I've always had it instilled in me, mainly from my parents, I suppose. I love them; they are fantastic people, but obviously they didn't know that I had ADHD as a child. So, you know, a lot of things that not, you know, neurotypical kids, would potentially, you know, find quite easy, like tidying up, going to bed at a certain time, all of these things were things that I really struggled with. You know, like emotional and especially sleep regulation is a really difficult thing for people with ADHD. And for me, I had no concept of bedtime at all. You know, like 1 minute I'd look at the clock, it would be 6 o'clock. The next I'd look and it'd be 10:30, and I'd have spent half, you know, like maybe half of my evening on PlayStation. And my parents would be like, "What are you doing? Go to bed." And for me, I just didn't have that trigger in my head to go, "Oh, I'm tired now. I need to go to bed." So yeah, for me, I guess I always just thought, "What's wrong with me?" When actually, no, there wasn't anything wrong. It was just that my brain is different. And I think that is it's been a really like fantastically powerful tool actually to go, do you know what? There's nothing wrong, because there never was anything wrong. It's just that my brain is, you know, neurodivergent, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Yeah, it's been interesting, but I do think that kind of taps into my next question quite nicely as well, Steph. Of you know, is neurodiversity in cybersecurity important, and if so, why? I mean, you've kind of already answered the question, but I do feel like it's definitely worth discussing. So maybe we could go to, I mean, Chris, from a hiring perspective, it's probably quite good to get your thoughts as well, and then maybe we'll go around to whoever is happy to answer next. But yeah, Chris, what do you think?
I think that diversity on a whole is important, with everything that's captured in that word. Again, you know, that word tends to in kind of common use, it tends to get kind of narrowed down. And I think we need to take that word back up again and make it much more inclusive. It is people who think differently, for example. You only benefit from diversity, right? I am a very strong believer that, again, the more differences you can bring together, when they all come together, out comes the best product. And so I think it's incredibly important, not just in cybersecurity, but everywhere, right? Across everything. And I don't think I'm breaking any amazing ground saying that, but I think it's super important. And like I said, I just think that we need to expand that term diversity to include many more things than people think it typically includes.
Can I kind of just jump in a sec? The idea of inclusion is kind of where we want to get to, isn't it? It's kind of like, it doesn't matter who I am, what color I am, none of that stuff should matter. I should be able to get through an interview process that allows me to showcase my skill set, because the job was written in such a way that anybody could read it, reduce the ambiguity. What are you really looking for? And that it isn't about a personality. Okay, ethos and all of that sort of stuff happens within the walls or within, the four corners of a screen, if that's how you want to live and be and do your work. But actually what we're moving towards is, I know of some younger people who have learned to manage their autism or their ADHD or whatever that, or the coterminous scenarios that they're living with, that have no interest in a diagnosis, because they just want to work somewhere where they can be successful. And that's kind of what I think we're kind of trying to move towards, isn't it? And what you just sort of mentioned, Chris, about inclusion.
And to that point, Steph, and to Chris's as well, when I think about that word diversity, right, and what we're ultimately trying to achieve, to your point, Steph, is we're trying to challenge traditional or conventional thinking so that we create a space and an environment where you don't need to define something by a label, because the way you are, the way you think is accepted and it's rewarded, and actually it's nurtured and it's needed, right? If I think about your first question, Becca, and that term neurotypical, when I think about the ways that we work in cyber insecurity, but I think, to your point, Chris, as a whole, it's set up to run in a neurotypical way. You can see that in the way that you have to prioritize your time, depending on the size of something or the urgency. The prefrontal cortex needs to work hard, right? And we know we struggle with that. At the same time, because that's the environment that we have to sometimes fit in, doesn't mean that we aren't as worthy, doesn't mean that we aren't as talented, doesn't mean that we're not as capable. It is just that the constructs of that way of working don't get the most from us. And if we can shift that structure or that environment, not only can you create one where you can get even more from us, it gets to that point that you don't need that label, because you've created a boundary, you've created an environment that just nurtures everyone and everything. But right now, I think because it is still quite new and people still are trying to understand it, and you probably don't have enough neurodivergent people in the positions of where true change can come from. How quickly is it going to happen? I don't know. But little things like this and people listening to understand is definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Alice, what are your thoughts?
I mean, everyone has brought up kind of, I echo what everyone has said pretty much. I think diversity as a whole across the board is something that is hugely important, and something that I'm glad that people are actively committing to and have stats and goals that they have to reach. But equally, it will be so great to get to a workforce where you don't need to have those stats, because we all sort of harmoniously figure out a way to work together, but also what works best for us. I think diversity for like neurodiversity is different than some of the other diversity categories in that you can't see it, so it's not obvious right away. So you can be working around many people who are neurodiverse, and it's probably a lot more than we think, not just because people don't talk about it, but also people haven't gotten diagnosed. I mean, the statistics of people who have been diagnosed as ADHD adults is like pretty staggering, actually. So I think that there's this whole group of people that haven't actually gotten that diagnosis, don't even realize that they should get that diagnosis, and I'm actually not sure that they would be considered neurodiverse, because I think there might be more people who fit into that category than fit into the neurotypical, and that everyone's just sort of been masking and like fitting this like mold of how they believe they should be acting. I mean, I don't have any stats on that, so it's really just speculation. So, we can't obviously say, but I just think that there are a lot more people out there who have some level of neurodiversity, or that they may not know about. But back to the diversity thing, I mean, it's we need it for so many different reasons, but there are things that neurotypical people can do that very, very easily, as we've all discussed, that people who have ADHD just can't do as well. We can try, and we work really hard to kind of try and reach them, but it's harder for us. But equally, there are things that we can do that they can't, or can't do as well. So I think finding that balance and finding, like, let's play on each other's strengths, which is what you do in any role, right? Not everyone comes into a job and is like, I'm really good at this, I'm not as good at this. And then if you're a good manager in a good company, you obviously try and help people build strengths that they don't have, but you definitely capitalize on the strengths that they do. So it's the same thing with having a neurodiverse team and a non-neurodiverse team. You figure out who's good at what, how do we emphasize that, how do we leverage that, and vice versa. I mean, it's pretty standard, I think. Or it's not, but it should be. I mean, it can be.
Alice, I would like to something that I think you said there is super important. I think so much of our experience as humans is on a spectrum, and we try to make it binary. And because it's convenient for us to put it into one of two buckets, right? Or several buckets, without realizing that there likely is a spectrum there. And I also think that, and I struggle with this word, the word accommodations, because I feel that it smuggles in some things that I think that in some ways it smuggles in some connotations like lowered expectations that I'm not comfortable with. But it's the only word that I have. But I think that if accommodations are put in for people who are neurodiverse, I think the whole workforce will benefit. I don't think it's just going to be neurodiverse. If we fix those things, if we remove that ambiguity that you were talking about earlier, I think everyone will benefit from it. I don't think it's just going to be the neurodiverse who benefit.
That's such a good point, isn't it? I mean that, yeah, like I could, as I said before, I could sit and talk for hours about why I think it is so important that we, champion neurodiversity and diversity and inclusion as a whole, like not just in cybersecurity, but in business. Again, it just comes back to the fact that there are people in those businesses, and they are the ones driving the statistics behind, like board numbers and things. Like every number you see, there is a person behind that who's put that in practice. And yeah, I really identified with what you said just there, Chris, because I feel like, I'm sure that I've had it said to me by bosses in previous jobs before, there are accommodations we can make, or there are adjustments we can make. And I remember thinking, adjustments, cool. So, and then maybe this is just an ADHD thing, but in my brain I was going, adjustments, okay, so what do they mean when they say adjustments? Do they mean that I'm not good enough and that I'm going to have to take a step back? Does that mean that I'm not good at my job? Oh my God, does that mean that, I shouldn't be here? Does this mean that I need to leave and find a different job? And, maybe that's just rejection sensitivity dysphoria coming in as well. But yeah, it's really, really important that we do champion the right language as well, isn't it? I think, to, give us the tools to be able to articulate what we need, but also not ostracize people from, their particular diagnosis and what's going on in their lives, So yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. And it brings me quite nicely on to my next question. Oh, sorry, Lee. Yeah. Sorry, what were you going to say?
So I just really want to quickly add this point, and it's to support both what Chris and yourself have just said, right? And I think it's really, really important that when we're talking about diversity, when we're talking about neurodiversity, that we try and remove the stigma, the negative connotations to it, right? So, as a few examples, emotional dysregulation, rejection sensitivity, or I often get labeled as someone who overthinks. And it frustrates me, right? Because just because I have or we have the capacity to think at a deeper level, to feel at a deeper level, because we have such a deep level of empathy, because we have experienced and felt so much that we know how other people around us feel. Just because I can feel that and I can see that, and someone else maybe can't, doesn't mean that I should be labeled with something that's negative. If anything, it should be seen as a good thing. It should be seen as that superpower. It should be seen as something that's harnessed rather than accommodations. It's how can we use that, to Alice's point, to get even more from you so that you can do what you need to fulfill what you want to achieve, that can help us as a business as well.
Do you know what?
Exactly.
That is such an important point, isn't it? And do you know what? I think it kind of speaks to a lot of debates that are happening in the not just in the ADHD community that I've kind of reached out to, but in the, you know, like just the sort of neurodiverse and diverse communities generally, is the language we use and the impact that can have on the people around us. I know that there's a podcast I've been following recently called Women and ADHD. And they always talk about, you know, at the end of the podcast, the lady that runs it, it's a lady called Katie Webber, and she will always say at the end, if you could rename ADHD to something else, what would it be? And the reason she asked that question is because she really doesn't like the fact that it stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The two D's in there specifically. What's disordered about me? Deficit in what way? Like, what does that mean to me as a person? And, you know, can that come across as really negative? Because to a lot of people, yes, it can, because the automatic connotation is deficit means less of. Disorder means something that is not ordered. So what is wrong with me? And that's not how we want people to feel in the community. We want them to feel like they, you know, like rightly you said, Lee, like they can, you know, tap into their superpower. And it's something my managing director says to me all the time: use ADHD as your superpower. It is your superpower. And yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that it is definitely something that, you know, we should all be wary of. Or wary might sound a little bit threatening, but it's definitely something that we should be speaking to people about at the very least, in terms of communication. And I did want to circle back round to, you know, something that you said about, you know, tapping into everybody's strengths and the flexibility that comes with that. So one of the other questions that I had was, is flexibility important for not just candidates with ADHD, but neurodiverse candidates? And if so, are you happy to elaborate on why? I mean, from personal experience for me, I don't know, I feel like I could probably start off, but I struggle with time as a concept. I'm sure a lot of you here today can probably identify with that on some level, but because there is such a narrow window between making you early for something and late for something, for people with ADHD, that can be a real problem. For me especially, I know that I have to be in the office for 8:30 on a Monday, and I have to really like make sure that I get up early, I'm out of the house on time, I leave enough time to get to work so that I'm there at least 20 minutes before my day starts. Because if I don't have that routine, I won't get to work for 8:30. And it's something that I've yeah, really struggled with. And so for that reason, it's important that I've got flexible core hours as well as that. So we have our set days on a Monday, and then the rest of the week I can come in anytime up until about 9 o'clock. And that has been an absolute lifesaver for me. So yeah, that's an example of flexibility that I can think of. But yeah, I wonder if maybe we could start with Lee again. Like what do you think about flexibility for neurodiverse candidates, and specifically maybe for ADHD candidates as well? Like, how important is it?
I think it's hugely important, right? And I want to start with the people side of it, and having an awareness, or the people around you having an awareness for it, because you do need people around you who have patience. You need people around you who have perspective, and most importantly, you need people around you who don't hold judgment. And I think that those are things that they can find more easily if they understand the type of person you are. if they know that there are things that you find more difficult than others, but they also know how they can get even more from you, it's already starting to frame that relationship in a way that is more constructive, right? And with that, it makes the conversation easier that if you need to work later into the night because there's less distractions, your kind of senses are calmer so you can focus more, that's okay. And you know as a person that you can ask or request that. For me, that's definitely one of the most important things is the people side of it. And to I guess to add to that, as well as the people around you, it's down to you as well. I think when I got my diagnosis, it helped make a lot of sense for me as to who I was, what my values were, and that gave me a level of confidence that I felt I didn't have before, where I could speak about that and I could articulate that, as opposed to just thinking, why do I struggle with this? Am I lazy? Am I not focused? Am I not hardworking? No, there was a reason for it. And that confidence meant that I could take the discussion to the people who I felt safe talking to and saying, can we try this? Can we try that? It might be extended hours. It might be blocking out time in my diary where I just have a break and I just stop and I might meditate or I might just go outside. But for me, things like that, but also, yeah, headphones that block out sound, working in a place where there's not much around you that's moving. So you can try and put yourself in a position where you're giving yourself the best chance of hyper focusing and working, as opposed to being distracted by noises or things around you.
Yeah, that's something that I definitely identify with.
Can I jump in a sec?
focus. Of course, yeah, Steph, please do.
I just wanted to say, so earlier Alice mentioned because she'd had quite an early diagnosis, which is amazing, right? That's so cool. And that you've more recently become reacquainted with that, sort of like it sort of reminds me, and then I hear what Lee is saying. So Lee is really on top of what it is, the language, articulating, because of the more recent. So he's had a much more recent learning experience about himself. I'm yet to work out what my learning experience about myself will be. I could probably list a few and say this is what I need, but I don't. Unlikely, I can't articulate what my needs are specifically. And so I kind of thought that was interesting, the similarities and yet the very slight differences between Alice and Lee. The awareness, the language, and around the awareness, or the language that comes with awareness, because now we're talking about specifics, right? It's anything you learn ends up having some specifics around it. And we move away from diversity and everybody into the specifics of what is it for ADHD, what is it for. And I think one of the questions, Becca, that you've got here is, what adjustments can workplaces make? Well, ask your employee what he or she needs. And then ask them again a couple of months later, because once they've settled in, it's going to be different. I need different stuff when I think about how I operate generally. I mean, my other half over the weekend was like, can you just please stop moving the furniture? And then and then I'm on LinkedIn, and one of the things is that people move furniture, so me and my mum, more than likely, it's a whole little Pandora's box, sort of nerves around it, as well as sort of this maybe getting to the edge of something where I get a whole new vision. So yeah, I'm really loving what Alice has had to say and what Lee has had to say. So yeah.
That's so interesting, Steph. Yeah, I mean, I also identify with moving furniture around a lot. It drives my other half insane, especially when I can't tidy anything else in the house. It just tends to be the furniture that gets moved incrementally.
Can I just articulate that very quickly, just in terms of validating the behavior, right? Because I don't want you to take that experience and feel like someone's judging you for it. And I think, again, I'm going to keep reinforcing the positive psychology behind this because we need to, right? That when we do forms of stimming, be moving furniture, it could be listening to a song again and again and again. Because our brains don't produce very much dopamine, you are trying to find sources of dopamine in what you're doing, and it's giving you that release. And because we don't produce very much of it, we're constantly looking for that instant gratification because our nervous systems are interest based. They are not that neurotypical kind of decision making process based. They can wait for their dopamine hit. We cannot. It's the way our brains are wired. It's not because of anything else. So you will search for it constantly. And it's why we do things like that. So I just wanted to get that point across because, again, let's get out of that habit that we're being a nuisance or we're being difficult or we're being disruptive, because then people listening to this or people hearing this will think that about themselves.
Yeah. Good
That's
point.
such an important point,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah, I mean, it's again, it goes back to me kind of, I guess, comparing myself to, you know, a neurotypical brain when actually I don't have one, and having to come to terms with that as well. And absolutely, as you said, there's nothing wrong with it. It's about how I kind of champion my language going forward, isn't it? Really, like reclaiming that and you know, understanding that actually my ADHD is, you know, just part of who I am, and that is absolutely fine, and that's not going to change, and I can absolutely not feel ashamed about it. And yeah, it's been an experience. But Alice, what are your thoughts?
I mean, it's interesting what you were saying, Steph, about the kind of the parallel or the differences between me and Lee. And I don't know. I guess well, one thing I will say is that I'd say even 5 years ago, conversations like this were not really happening. It was still something that not that people weren't as aware of, but also it was something that, and this is what, Lee, I love the fact that you keep bringing it back to the positives, because it's something that you didn't really talk about because it could be seen as this really, really bad thing and something that you should be embarrassed about or that you should be hiding. And so, you know, I think we probably all have done quite a lot of work at figuring out how to slot into how we should be trying to behave or what's normal behavior. And I mean, at least, I mean, I remember when I think I was about 12, and I told my parents, like, I really hate being on medication. It really makes me feel weird. I don't like it. It changed my personality. And I want to stop. And my parents were like, that's absolutely fine. Of course, if that's not what's right for you, that's not what's right for you. And I met with the doctor, and the doctor's like, of course we can take you off, but just so you realize you're going to have to work like 10 times harder than everyone else to get the same results. Which shows a lot about the way kind of like the education system is framed and workplace is framed, but that's a whole other conversation. In terms of flexibility, I think, well, I think COVID has helped a lot with the way, like, flexible working and the way that the world has shifted in the way that we communicate and operate. I would say that I mean, even before COVID, I had always gravitated towards roles that had flexibility in them. Whether or not that's just my personality or an ADHD coping mechanism, I don't know. But I was always going for roles that would allow me to work from home or at least have a hybrid working kind of environment. And that's the same way now. But you know, I think a lot of it is also communicating and talking to your workplace about what you need and what you want. And where I work now is incredible in the fact that if you take time off, they actually expect you to take time off. They don't want you to work or send emails, and also they like you to keep certain working hours because they're trying to take away burnout, and I get that. But sometimes when I'm on holiday, I get this really great idea, because I'm not working, so my brain is like, "Ooh, I can really think strategically," and I'll send an email. And previously, people were like, "You really shouldn't be working on holiday." Now they get it because I've explained to them, like, my brain has been clear. I've had a lot of time. Like, this idea popped in my head. I will not remember it in an hour, so I have to write it down and send it to you because otherwise I won't have it. You know, and then I'll remember it like 3 months later. And so I think having the flexibility of, obviously, don't encourage your colleagues to work crazy hours. And I don't expect for my colleagues to respond to my emails at 10 o'clock at night, because that doesn't necessarily work for them. But if something comes into my head at 10 o'clock at night, or I work better because I don't sleep well, so I can sometimes work at night and then maybe start a little bit later in the morning, because I've been working, up late. I think having that kind of flexibility, but also being cognizant of the fact that I want people to be respectful of what works for me, but I also have to be respectful for what works for them. So as I said, I can't expect for people to respond to me at 9 p.m. And that's why I think core working hours are important. So you can say, these are the core working hours. People should be available at that time so that, we're not making demands of people to fit exactly only what we need. But yeah, that's sort of my rambling thought process.
Not rambling at all, and I identify with the sort of core working hours. I'm the same. I did a creative writing degree, or two technically, actually. Gosh, I forget about that. Before I came to Info People, and yeah, the creative process is interesting enough as it is, but now that I look back on it, I kind of think about all the times where I had this great idea for a story, and it'd be just so I was trying to fall asleep, or like something like I'd be out walking like with the dog or something, or I'd be out in town, or I wouldn't have a notepad or anything on me, and I'd just suddenly think, oh, this amazing idea just came to my head, and I'd suddenly like get my phone out and use that to write on and just hyper focus for about, to me it felt like 10 minutes, and then I'd look at my watch and an hour and a half would have gone by where I'd just have been writing, and I'd have been like, oh gosh, where's all that time gone? But yeah, I think that's such an important point about why it's important to be flexible. Chris, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I think, and I can't take credit for this because it's an example that was given to me by a friend. But I think, it kind of deals with the, I think it's a tangible example, given kind of the hiddenness of neurodiversity that we've talked about. I think there's a lot of business practices that we've adopted that we've just held on to that aren't necessarily valuable to the business, but because we've always done them, we hold on to them. And I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but in the States here, for example, cashiers are expected to stand. Why? Why do cashiers need to stand? And who does that eliminate from those positions? Because we expect them to stand. And when he presented that example, it really, it was an aha moment for me, absolutely, where I was like, yes, why? Why do we expect them to stand? Is it just because we think it looks better? And, and I think that we need to evaluate those business processes that we've, all of them, to see which ones we've adopted that aren't actually adding any value to the business.
That's such an important point. Yeah, I didn't realize that cashiers in America had to stand until I think you told me actually, Chris. And it's just crazy, isn't it? Like you can't ask something of somebody that they physically can't do. So if you had a candidate who was a wheelchair user, for example, that would just be an option that wasn't available to them job-wise. And that's really sad to think about, really. Yeah, did anybody else have any thoughts on that as well? Just before I go on,
just kind of thinking there are some dead end scenarios like cashiers standing because they always have, and maybe the reason that's the case is because nobody's ever thought about it. But what you're actually doing is when somebody in a wheelchair shops across the States, for instance, they will never even try to apply for that role because they always see people standing. And then we go into that whole plethora of data that says if I can't see it, I can't be it, blah, blah, all of that kind of stuff across all of the diversity type pieces. So it's, and I think maybe ADHDs are really good at picking up on those teeny scenarios, the thing that niggles. What's wrong with that picture? What's wrong with that picture? I'll focus in on something and somebody, oh, well, Steph, it doesn't really matter. So I can put it down for about 4 seconds and then I'm back to it. What's wrong with that picture? What is wrong with that picture? 9 times out of 10, I will always get an answer. And probably 8 times out of 10, I've managed to change something that didn't really matter, but actually the unfolding of that thing that nobody cared about because it didn't matter has really changed scenarios. in the past for me.
I guess I'm just going to challenge that a little bit instead of say that it did matter, right? Because it's the catalyst for change. And that's one thing that I really learned to embrace since getting my diagnosis, is just how deeply we feel empathy and how our moral compass is always pointing true north, which I think, to Alice's point, and I think all the points we've been making kind of throughout this, right? You just think it's you think it's normal, you think it's what other people think and feel. But the reality is that they don't. But because we have the capability to think at that level and feel at that level, we need to be in those positions where we can challenge, because we won't just accept, well, this is the way it's always been done, and nor should we.
I think
Yeah.
that's what I loved about Cybersecurity Challenge, is that I went to somebody at the Cabinet Office one day and said, oh, so-and-so's been given this job, but and I haven't, like, why wasn't I given that job? And she looked at me and laughed, and I still walked away confused, and she went, Steph, your role is way bigger than that. And I had no idea what she was talking about, but they were kind of like, here's this small little thing going off and saying, hey, has cyber looked over here for this stream of, you know, people that we should really be thinking about employing, and why aren't we, and breaking down those kinds of barriers. When I look back, that's kind of, I was kind of allowed to do what I was off leash, 100% off leash. You know, I loved that last job. So yeah, anyway.
That's so like, yeah, it's just so true of our ADHD traits though, I guess, isn't it? Like I mean, I have always been drawn to people in, you know, difficult situations. Like I remember you know, being sort of 25 and walking down the street in London for one of my previous jobs and seeing about 4 or 5 homeless people. And I was with friends at the time, and every time I would stop and get a sandwich from Pret or like get some food and just give them food. And all of my friends were like, why are you doing this? Like that's going to cost you at least 50 quid. And I was like, because those people need my help and I want to help them because I feel so badly that they're struggling and that my friends just couldn't grasp it. And that's not me going, woohoo, I'm amazing. It's not, you know, and I would never say that, but I do think that that speaks to the empathy. You know, we feel other people's pain and other people's feelings so deeply. And trying to articulate that to somebody who doesn't necessarily feel that is quite tricky. It's like, it's hard to get them to kind of be on the same wavelength, I suppose. But then again, you know, it taps into the superpowers you're talking about, Lee, right? Where, you know, we can empathize with other people, and that's what makes us great to be in, you know, just around generally, not just in you know, in business and cybersecurity, but in friendship groups as well, and, you know, just wider life. So on that note, I think we have time for one more question, and I was really keen to sort of get an ADHD specific question in, given the panel of people that have joined me today. And you know, it's been absolutely fantastic having everybody on. I think that we've had some really, really great discussions. But you know, I've been reading some statistics since my sort of diagnosis / self-diagnosis around ADHD, and it can actually co-occur with other neurodiverse conditions. So I think the most common ones in the UK are autism, anxiety, and depression, because often ADHD can be misdiagnosed as ADHD and as anxiety, sorry, or depression. Case in point here, right? Do you think it's important for workplaces to recognise or educate themselves around ADHD co-occurring with other conditions? And, you know, is that the key to retaining neurodiverse talent as well? Because I know that there's not necessarily an issue hiring neurodiverse candidates, but there is, you know, a real correlation in retaining them as well. So I wonder if I could go to Chris for this last question first, mainly because I know you're quite closely involved with the hiring process. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yes. I mean, my short answer is yes. Obviously, we need to be aware of those. You know, I am not ashamed and not quiet about the fact that I have had my own mental health struggles, and I have had various levels of acceptance and understanding in my own employment situation. And that is something that I pride myself on, is extending that understanding as best I can to those folks who work with me and around me. And so again, my short answer is yes, I think that's very important.
Fantastic. Yeah. And what about you, Alice?
I mean, I think the sign of any good organization or manager is to understand all of your employees and what motivates them and the support that they need, regardless of whether they identify as someone with ADHD or not, because there's no such thing as a one size fits all approach to just life or work. I think that there are. I think and it's, as I said, it's harder because it's not something you can see, right? You can't see if someone is ADHD or has anxiety or has depression. You have to sort of rely on them to tell you, or and for that you need to be able to build an organization that's like very supportive and like have mutual trust and collaboration. I think that's the kind of working environment that you need to build to really be successful in having people have those open conversations and helping with retention, etc. Um, but yeah, I think there are certain things that you can do to definitely make it easier. If you can set out clear reasons for why you're having those conversations, or you set out clear clear objectives so that people, I think that a lot of times, I mean, at least for me, the times that I felt like undervalued, I suppose, or like wanted to leave an organization is where I felt like someone didn't understand me or wasn't able to communicate and support me um, in a way that I needed, and that could be my fault for not accurately communicating it. But yeah, I think if you know someone's ADHD, or you know someone is dyslexic, or you know someone has anxiety, if you know someone has something, you should figure out what it is they need, and a lot of that is asking it. And I think I mean, studies show this is nothing groundbreaking, that people who feel valued and supported tend to work harder and stay places longer. I mean, that's, again, this is not news to anyone. It certainly shouldn't be, and if it is, you really shouldn't be in a hiring position. But yeah, I mean, I think yes, but I think that's across the board.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. And again, I also identify with the one-to-ones. Can I borrow you for 5 minutes, Becca?
Like, that's it. That's it. I'm packing my stuff.
Yeah, literally. It's yeah, it's something that I identify with. It's yeah, every time. Can I just borrow you for a minute? Or have you got 5 minutes? Or do you want to just come into my office? Okay, sure. Well, they're gonna fire me, right? What have I done? Like, I immediately just go through in my head. I'm like, what did I do over the past 24 hours that could possibly, yeah, I'm like you, Alice, I can't sleep. But Steph, what about you?
If somebody comes over to me and says, have you got 5 minutes? I'm like, yeah. Even if I'm in the middle of something, I'm like, yeah, something new, love it. Somebody from outside my department says, oh, Steph, can you help me? Yeah, I'm there. You know, I love doing new stuff. If it, you know, do workplaces need to educate themselves? It's interesting in that I have an experience where managers were given a different script in order to interview when the person coming through the door had disclosed that they were spectrum or AD or whatever. And so they would flip to this new script, and they used it enough to get to a point whereby people didn't need to disclose anymore. Because once you've got an idea of what it looks and feels like, because quite often for the stuff that you can't see, you get a feeling. You know, people sometimes with ADHD don't sit still very long, or they're playing with something, or they're jumping between conversations. You know, there's that kind of stuff going on. And this hiring manager didn't need to flip the script anymore. And what they eventually worked out is, because of the reduction massively of the ambiguity to the new script, they just stopped using the old script altogether. Because actually very young staff starting their first or second job will agree a lot with you, and yes, I can do that, without really understanding what it is you're asking of them. And too scared to ask the question about the details, because they'll go home and research it maybe. So actually it really worked, the idea that opening up the doors, understanding the differences, flipping the scripts, reducing the sort of ambiguity and being clearer, and removing the need for, you know, are you 18, you know, that kind of stuff. The most sensory of autistics are team players. You know, you it's just, how did they want to play? You know, how did they want to play? Well, they were the Wizard of Clapham Common, and anybody that wanted to come and use their library could at any time of the day or night, just as long as he didn't have to deal with them. So it's, you know, yes, it's really important. And yeah, great question. Thank you.
No, thank you, Steph, and everyone else. And then last but by no means least, Lee, I feel like you will have a lot to say about this in, you know, the interest of like being positive and championing positive change as well. So what are your thoughts around that question about like ADHD co-occurring with other symptoms, and yeah, how organizations can help recognize that potentially?
So to Chris's point, the short answer is yeah, it needs to be something that is near the top of that priority list, right? Because the more we can understand people, the more we can help people. The other points that I wanted to make, particularly around that recruitment process, often you can see someone's body language, you can see their posture or their tone, and you might perceive that to be something which is either shy or timid or not confident. But what I would just like to reinforce for people listening to this and for everyone on the call is that when we think about the experiences that people who are neurodiverse have gone through all of their life, you've been told you're disruptive, you've been told you can't sit still, you've been told that you can't concentrate, you've been told negative things throughout your life, that it is going to impact your self-esteem. And you have to work so hard to help yourself and maintain or build that positive image of yourself. But it's not easy, right? And so people might come into these interview settings and a neurotypical person might say, well, they're not very confident, they're not very this. But they don't know the struggles and the effort that that person has had to go through to even get themselves into that position, right?
Exactly.
And if we can create awareness for that ahead of time, there's enough perspective there from the person who may be conducting the interview, who could be a neurodivergent or could be neurotypical, to at least have an awareness, right? That this person maybe isn't necessarily choosing to think and feel this way, but because of the things that they've been told, the ways they've been judged throughout their life, it's conditioned them to think that way. I really hope that the more that we learn about neurodiversity in schools, that children now going through the education system will learn that it is that superpower and it is a good thing, as opposed to what probably all of us went through, which was just being blamed and victimized and seen as just disruptive and not helpful. And so I think that self-esteem element is really important. Don't just look at someone who may be coming across that they're not fully confident in themselves and judge them for that, because they've been conditioned to think like that. And I think that in the interest of time, but also my battery on my laptop, which is critically low, and I might have to try and get my charger in a minute. This is very ADHD. I'll leave that as my answer to that question.
Yeah, do you know what? I think that is no, a really, really good place to round off the round table, as it were. Yeah, I have really thoroughly enjoyed speaking to everyone today. I think this has been a really productive conversation. You know, in the interest of not trying to sound like a cliche, I do think that there's a lot to think about when it comes to, you know, championing neurodiversity and cybersecurity, and also the workplace more generally, and just the wide world. And, you know, to speak to what you just said, Lee, self-esteem is a huge part of that. And, you know, helping nurture everyone's self-esteem as well, I think is a really, really key part of our journey together. But thank you all so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Steph. And thank you, Lee, as well. I've really enjoyed speaking to all of you. I think this has been fantastic. And yeah, I will look forward to saying goodbye off camera. But thank you all for your time today.